Okay. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Ginat and the Rice House, for inviting me here to lecture. My name is Dr. Debra Kimless, and I'm here to talk with you about medical cannabis. Is that a true option or an oxymoron? And so I'm going to share my screen, I think. And I think that worked. Did it? You could see it all? Excellent. All right. And so this is my disclaimer. The lawyers tell me I have to write this. So again, my name is Dr. Debra Kimless. I am a physician, allopathically trained, boarded in anesthesiology, pain medicine, and lifestyle medicine, which means that everything I'm going to talk with you about today was not taught to me in any traditional educational platform for which I was exposed. So not in college, not in medical school, not in residency, not in any of the countless millions of dollars of CME credits I had to take with courses. And in fact, I had really no knowledge or understanding of cannabis or marijuana, as people may know it. Or if you're all in Israel and I'm the only US citizen, cannabis. Because I grew up during the time that this person, does everyone know who this is? This is Nancy Reagan, and she had a raging campaign of just say no. And part of that was that this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs. And so I'm like, wow, I don't want to have a fried egg as a brain. As a child, I knew I wanted to be a physician. And so I actually bought the rhetoric because, gosh, what politician would ever lie to us? Right? That's not a thing. But I realized after over a decade and a half of being a traditional physician that I was actually the puppet for the pharmaceutical industry. And I recognized and did a very deep introspective evaluation as to what my educational path was, where it took me, and how it kind of brainwashed me and countless other physicians to think that you have a disease or an illness and you have a pill or a surgical procedure. And when I recognized that that was really just a marketing ploy for pharmaceuticals to sort of promote themselves, not to suggest that all pharmaceuticals are bad. There's a time and a place for it, but you can't just look at disease equals drug. I think I rocked in a corner for about 3 weeks until I really sort of wrapped my head around it. And I got to understanding medical cannabis or cannabis at all through my understanding of plants as medicine. And so I told you that I'm boarded in lifestyle medicine. I used to treat patients and I treat myself with a whole food, all plant, no added oil, no processed food diet. And I got to understand the power of plants and the transformation that occurs when you actually use food to nourish you and to sustain you rather than just eating garbage because this is what, Madison Avenue and the people that have been trained to brainwash us have brought to us and calling it food. And because I was open to understanding that, I was also open to understanding what cannabis is and what it does. And so in 2013, when my mom actually died from a complication from a pharmaceutical, and my significant other, who is an Israeli man, looked at me and said, in Israel, they're studying this medical marijuana stuff. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, I don't even understand. We actually went to Israel, met Raphael Mishulam, and learned and studied with him and his group, and went to Hadassah Hospital and saw people being dosed, understanding what medical cannabis is. And then when I came back to the States and saw legal states having a whole bunch of different conditions for which medical cannabis is being used, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. It's, wasting syndrome and inability to eat and chronic pain and seizures, muscle spasms, glaucoma, nausea, depression. I mean, all of these seemingly disparate diseases. And I thought, gosh, can this even be true? Like, how are all of these things treated by this one plant? And so today I'm going to speak with you a little bit about the history of cannabis, something called the endocannabinoid system, how the cannabis works within our body, how you actually can use cannabis and why that actually matters. And then I'm going to share with you some case reports. And this is a complicated sciencey talk. If people have questions, Gennad, if you see them in the chat, we can address them as they go along, because if we continue to go down the road, they may not understand or, forget what it was. All right, so we're going to start with this news break. Cannabis as a medicine is not new. I mean, this is not a new thing. And in fact, 2737 BC in China, the emperor of China actually used cannabis. He fashioned himself as a pharmacist, and he actually looked at cannabis and used it for gout, arthritis, and absent-mindedness, which I find to be really interesting because, people say, oh, when you smoke cannabis, dude, where's my car? But yet he used it for absent-mindedness, which I think is a term then for what we currently use as dementia. In 1000 BC in India, they used a drink called bhang, which is they heated milk, put cannabis in it, and they used it as an anesthetic. Ancient Egyptians used it actually to treat tumors. And I used to say, if you could read hieroglyphics, then we probably would know the cure to cancer. In 200 BC, in Greece, who loved their war horses, they would take raw cannabis leaves and apply it to the horses to reduce swelling and inflammation after a war or an injury. And then they recognized, wow, this is powerful stuff. It actually works. And they started using it in people for earache, swelling, inflammation, of course, other veterinary medicine. And then coming to more current times, in 1830s, there was a very smart doctor named Dr. William O'Shaughnessy who studied in India and treated patients and noticed that they were using cannabis for all sorts of things, but including rabies, when they would have rigor from rabies and incredibly intense muscle contractions, and they would use cannabis and would note muscle relaxation. He then brought cannabis to Western medicine. And when he went back to England, this is Queen Victoria, and he actually treated her for dysmenorrhea, which is for painful menstrual cramps. And I always sort of joke and say, this is a before picture. And in 1851 to 1941, cannabis was listed in the US Pharmacopoeia. My grandfather during this time period was a pharmacist, and I imagine that he actually used cannabis tinctures in his pharmacies. And this is labels from Abbott Labs and from Parker. So I'm sorry, Eli and Parker, and they actually use cannabis in pharmacies. And this is what a label would look like. So this isn't new. And now currently in the US, there's 37 states, DC, Guam, US Virgin Islands, that have a medical problem. And 21 states in the US, plus the District of Columbia, are permitted to use it for adult use or recreational use. I find it particularly funny that it's federally illegal in this country, but in Washington, DC, where all the feds hang out, it is completely legal. So go figure. So anyway, the reason why I finally learned and understood cannabis to be a real live medicine is because we have a biologic system called the endocannabinoid system. I never heard of it. It was never taught to me in any biology class that I took, medical school, residency, internship, nothing. But we have a real biologic system called the endocannabinoid system. And if anyone ever heard of this, pat yourself on the back, because you know something that the majority of physicians, at least in this country, don't know and certainly don't accept. So What is the endocannabinoid system? The endocannabinoid system is a biologic system whose importance is to maintain physiologic balance. It controls everything from thinking to pooping and everything in between. It is made up of different things. One is called, well, endo means from endogenous, cannabinoids means that our own bodies make molecules similar to the cannabis plant molecule. And it interacts in our system in ways similarly to how the cannabis plant does. And so the endocannabinoid system is broken down into three things. One are the molecules that our own body make. We make a lot of them, but the two most studied is called anandamide and 2-AG. We'll get into that in a sec. There are receptors, areas in our body for which these chemicals interact. The two most characterized are CB1 and 2. Again, we'll get into that. And then enzymes that make or break down those systems. And I had a slide here that I don't know where. Nope. Okay. So the question is, if this is so important, why is it that we never heard of it? Well, interestingly enough, the endocannabinoids are different than any other biologic system in our body. So different than organs like your heart or your liver, where we can literally cut you open and look at it, and different than a cellular-based system where you can look in a microscope and see red blood cells and white blood cells and immune cells. The endocannabinoid system is chemical-based, and it took them a really long time to identify these chemicals and to describe them. So we're going to do that now. So the first thing is called a receptor. Receptor is an area that receives, and then depending upon how it gets turned on or off will determine its function. So the first one is called the CB1 receptor, and it was discovered in 1988 in Israel by Dr. Raphael Mechoulam and Lumi Hanous with the most basic of instruments. It's a miracle these guys found this stuff. And it ends up that this CB1 receptor is the most abundant of its type receptor in our brains and nervous system. CB2 was discovered in 1993, again in Israel, and again by Dr. Raphael Mechoulam in his laboratory. And this is found in peripheral cells, predominantly in the immune system, thymus, pancreas, and our immune cells, but it's also expressed during times of stress in our brain. So in a traumatic brain injury, a brain tumor, a stroke, or even just Alzheimer's and dementia. But what was interesting about finding these receptors was that Dr. Mechoulam and his team said, wait a minute, these receptors are so important. It wasn't because there was some plant in Afghanistan that was going to interact with this. They knew that if they found receptors in our body, that our bodies must make something to interact with it. And so the hunt was on. And in 1992, again in Israel, Dr. Mechoulam and his team discovered anandamide, also known as 2-arachidinyl ethanolamide, or AEA. He called it anandamide because ananda is Sanskrit for bliss. So he called it the bliss molecule, meaning that when you smoked cannabis and you interacted with the CB1 receptor, you felt a little euphoric, and that was blissful. And so I loved his take on that. And in 1995, again, Dr. Mechoulam and his team found another molecule that interacted with CB2 receptor called 2-arachidinyl acid. And so endocannabinoids, although not taught in any biology class, is crucial to bioregulation. It regulates every other biologic system, and it does it locally. And it's the only neurochemical in our bodies that is not stored, which is really interesting. It's made on demand. It's used locally. It's rapidly broken down and not stored. And that's really important. And I'll get into that again in more detail when we talk about cannabis as a plant. So again, those receptors that we talked about, the key and this molecule here are the chemicals. And these areas below represent sort of the docking stations for within which these chemicals interact and then either turn on or turn off a biologic system. So these are receptors all over our bodies. So let's talk about CB1 receptor. Again, it's the most abundant receptor in our brain. And so, for example, like this lock and key, if you smoke cannabis and it interacts with an area called the cerebellum, where if you could see my arrow, I'm circling at that area, it may make you walk a little funny, like when you're drunk. But if you have something called Parkinson's disease, it may loosen up that cogwheel rigidity that you're experiencing. If it interacts with the area called the hypothalamus, I'm sure that you heard about the munchies, but if you're on chemotherapy and you can't eat, interacting and activating this area may stimulate some hunger to at least make food appealing to you to help counteract the adverse effects of chemotherapy. Same thing with if it interacts this area in the brainstem called the medulla, it may help reduce nausea and vomiting in an area called the chemoreceptive trigger zone. So yes, there are some interesting areas that it interacts with, but the really interesting areas where it doesn't interact with, which is the area in the brainstem in the pons. And that's the area which is called the cardiorespiratory area that it doesn't interact with. And so we look at the safety of something, and doctors call it the lethal dose 50. Well, 50% of people, the dose where 50% people would have a severe adverse reaction like death or, on death's door. So for ibuprofen, like Advil, that's 663 milligrams per kilogram. Caffeine, my favorite drug, 192 milligrams per kilogram. Nicotine, 50 milligrams per kilogram. So if you have that dose, 50% of people would die from that. Heroin, 22 milligrams per kilo. And so Francis Young wrote an opinion piece for the DEA back in 1988 and was charged by Ronald Reagan to look at this because they were discussing whether marijuana was safe or not safe and whether they should deschedule it from a Schedule 1 designation, which means it has no medical indications, no medical usefulness. It's highly addictive and it's terrible for you, like methamphetamine, like crack cocaine, like heroin. And that's where marijuana or cannabis is located now. So Francis Young said it would take a 70-kilogram man to smoke 1,500 pounds in 15 minutes in order for him to die. And it wouldn't be because of a overdose, it would be from carbon monoxide poisoning. So not even from cannabis. So when you look at a therapeutic index, that's a pharmaceutical's way of safety versus, so it's the toxic dose versus the effective dose for over-the-counter, like an aspirin. You take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning, your headache goes away. You take 40 and you end up in the hospital. Prescription drugs like Valium, you take 1 as an effective dose to reduce anxiety, perhaps. You take 10, you're in the hospital. Cannabis therapeutic index is 1 to 20 to 40,000. That's its safety profile or safety window. And so when you look at 2016, the top 15 reasons for death and despair and mortality in 2016, 0 from cannabis. Same thing looking at 2017, 0 from cannabis. A friend of mine said I had to have a fair and balanced approach to this conversation. Nothing is 100%. Yes, if you overconsume cannabis with high THC, you can have a rapid heart rate. You can transiently increase your blood pressure. Yes, it can cause sleepiness. There's something called hyperemesis disorder, used from an absurd amount and overconsumption of THC. Yes, it can cause euphoria, and at least in our country, we're euphoriophobic. God forbid you should feel euphoria. You can experience some hallucinations, and over-consuming over time can make you have some tolerance to it, meaning that you need more. So yes, when you use cannabis medicinally, we proceed with caution. We treat it like any other medicine. We titrate it and use a combination so that you don't have an overconsumption. We start slowly and titrate slowly. Receptors, back to receptors again. CB2 receptors are peripheral nerves, including immune cells, and it is involved really with immune modulating, with cell migration, and with immune function and inflammation. The second part, another part of the endocannabinoids, is the breakdown and the creation of these endocannabinoids. This is a really complicated slide to say that our bodies make AEA, or anandamide, and 2-AG, and we then rapidly break them down. Interestingly, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you want to sell a chemical in this industry, you're saying, let's look at how they break down these molecules. It's just these two single things, MAGL and Phi chemicals. And if I can interfere with those breakdown molecules, I can increase circulating anandamide and 2-AG. And so a company in 2016 in France did this, and it led to one person dead, 5 people injured, never came out of their serious brain issue. And they stopped doing this. The pharmaceutical companies say, well, this was a dirty molecule, meaning it affected more than just these fatty acid amide enzymes. I don't know. I think this is what happens when you fool with Mother Nature. So to go over the endocannabinoid system, we've got the endocannabinoids themselves. The most studied ones are anandamide and 2-AG. We know that they're produced on demand, only used locally, broken down and not stored. The two most studied receptors, but there's a lot more that they're studying now, including Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who's 92 and doesn't stop. He's amazing. Is CB1 and CB2. CB1 is predominantly found on nerve cells and central and peripheral nervous system. CB2 is found predominantly in immune cells, but also in other tissue scattered around our bodies, including the brain when it's injured. I read this slide directly because to me, this is a mind blow. Our US tax dollars pay for the NIH. The NIH wrote this in 2006, and listen to the language. In the past decade, so this is past tense, from 2006, which means 1996, the endocannabinoid system has been implicated, again, past tense, in a growing number of physiologic functions, both in the central, peripheral nervous system and peripheral organs. So that's CB1 and CB2 receptors. Modulating the activity of the endocannabinoid system turned out, again, past tense, to hold therapeutic promise in a wide range of disparate diseases and pathological conditions, ranging from mood and anxiety disorders, movement disorders such as Parkinson's and Huntington's, to neuropathic pain, MS, spinal cord injury, cancer, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, glaucoma, obesity, metabolic syndrome, osteoporosis, to name a few. I'm sorry. In my country, we don't treat anybody with any of these illnesses with cannabis, or looking at the endocannabinoid system and how to modulate it in order to improve or help deal with these issues. I'm appalled. When I give this lecture in the US, I say, raise your hand if you're appalled too. You should be, because we're now in 2023 and we still don't use this across the board. So let's talk about cannabis, the plant, and the body. So the cool thing about this plant, it is literally a chemical manufacturing factory. It has over 400 different chemicals All of them are bioactive. 100 of them, plus minus, are specific to the cannabis plant, called phyto, meaning plant, cannabinoids, meaning specific to the cannabis plant. There's over 100 terpenes. Terpenes are a chemical that is the reason for the plant's scent. Flavonoids, these are found that provide the color and are antioxidants and anti-inflammatory. And interestingly enough, the intoxicating effects are actually only in a few: THC, THCV, CBN. That's about it. Delta 8. And the majority of these compounds interact with our endocannabinoid system. So only a few intoxicating molecules. This thing has been banished for years. Is it because it has no medicinal effects? I think not. Is it because the pharmaceutical industry is having a hard time profiting? Perhaps. So this is like the iconic shape, that 5-fingered, fanned out plant, but really the action occurs here. This is called the flower as opposed to the leaves. And actually, these little areas, these outpocketings, are called trichomes. When people talk about crystals, oh my God, do you see the crystals on this? It's is really trichomes. And this is sort of like this little purse covered in a wax that stores all of the goodies that the cannabis plant makes. Interestingly enough, even though the toxicity for this plant is low, these chemicals are still very potent and toxic, which is why this plant holds them in this waxy handbag known as trichomes and doesn't hold them in cells within itself, which I find very interesting. So as the plant grows in nature, there is no CBD and there is no THC. It isn't until you apply time and temperature does the raw plant and the chemicals that the plant makes convert to the heated or the known things that are called THC and CBD. So interestingly enough, as the plant grows in nature, you have something called CBGA, the mother of all cannabinoids. It then converts through enzymes naturally to THCA, CBDA, CBCA. THCA and CBDA don't become THC and CBD until you heat it up. That's why people smoke it and rather than juice it. But that doesn't mean the raw plant isn't bioactive. In fact, it is just as potent a bioactive molecule as THC and CBD. Just doesn't get you high. So that's why people weren't really looking at it or studying it. And sadly, as we all get older, we all sort of degrade. And yes, the plant does as well. And it degrades to these chemicals where it says age to CBNA, CBN, T delta 8, CBL. And even those chemicals have bioactivity and importance. So when we look at THCA, for example, it's a muscle relaxant. It's an anti-proliferative. What does that mean? It means that it reduces aberrant cell growth. It's anti-inflammatory, anti-nausea, prevents seizures, helps with difficulty with sleep, and helps with pain. Yet THCA will never, never, never make you high or feel like, dude, where's my car? THC does have that intoxicating effect. It can be sedative. It can be energetic. It is antibacterial. It can bronchodilate. It can stimulate your appetite. CBDA, same stuff, a lot of crossover in its bioactivity. Same with CBDA, same with CBGA. So interesting, though, the story is not just about cannabinoids. You don't go and go into a wine shop and go, give me something with your highest alcohol content, right? You want something complex with flavor profiles and different ingredients. It's not all about the alcohol content. People aren't drinking Everclear and pairing it with, your tofu dish. So terpenes, the thing that gives you the scent and flavor. The reason for terpenes is that it's adaptive. It repels predators. It's an insecticide, and it lures pollinators. And interestingly, I would venture to say that the pollinator is us, that we have throughout millennia brought along this plant with us and planted it wherever we went, because we have recognized culturally throughout time before pharmaceuticals that there is medicinal value to this. And what's interesting is these terpenes in and of themselves have tremendous bioactivity. So if you smell something with a lot of a terpene called alpha pinene, and it's a bronchodilator, and it's an anti-inflammatory, and it helps with memory, antibacterial. If anybody has gone forest bathing into a pine forest and gone into this forest, taking a breath in, you feel like you could rule the world and you know everything. And it's this terpene, just highly concentrated in a pine forest. Linalool is what's in lavender. And if you smell lavender, it's relaxing, it's pain relieving, but it's also an anesthetic, believe it or not, and helps along with the cannabis to be an anti-seizure medicine. Beta caryophyllene actually sits on a CB2 receptor. Go figure. It stimulates an immune cell where the predominance of CB2 receptors are. And it's found in pepper. Interestingly, it's called a terpene. I contend it really should be called a cannabinoid. Myrcene, found in mango and in hops, contributes to the sedative effect of what some of these people on the streets call an indica versus a sativa. And it's a huge muscle relaxant, and combined with cannabis can relax muscles if you have MS and have a muscle spasm. Limonene, antidepressant. It's if you open up citrus and you smell it and it makes you feel better. It's very potent chemicals. So that's the thing that they call the entourage effect, the symphony effect. And in current medicine, we call it synergy, the synergistic effect, versus straight up Marinol or straight up THC. So since 1988, doctors could write prescriptions for THC all day long. It's called Marinol or dronabinol. And indication is for nausea and vomiting and anorexia, for HIV AIDS, and for chemotherapy. You don't hear a lot of talk on the street about it, because just like nobody's drinking Everclear, straight up, pure alcohol, pure THC makes you feel jittery and agitated and uncomfortable and hallucinating. And I don't know, I find it interesting that that's what the FDA approves with all of these adverse effects, because I don't think that's a pleasant experience. Yet the plant, taken properly and in small doses, can cause a little euphoria and allow for your appetite to increase and all of those things. But yet the FDA goes against that. So real quick shout out about CBD. CBD doesn't interact with CB1 or CB2 receptors. So you don't get the buzz. That was a little joke. From CBD. It is non-intoxicating, doesn't cause euphoria, but it still has tremendous medicinal value. It modulates receptors beyond CB1 and CB2, equally as important, equally as strong, but just acts differently. And because of time constraint, I can't get into all the issues, but if somebody has a CBD specific question or a question about any of this stuff, please let me know. I'll jump in and get into it. But methods of administration are hugely important when it comes to this plant. So this plant with those 400 chemicals is a pharmacy within itself. And even how you ingest it or you bring it into your body actually matters and will determine what molecules your body actually sees. So if you remember from that slide that says cannabis, as it grows in nature in its raw form, is in its acid form, and those forms are bioactive, and it isn't until you have time and temperature does it convert to THC and CBD. That heat in something like inhalation or vaporization will then determine the types of chemicals your body sees. So let's dive into that. So when you talk about smoking, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. So you can roll it in a joint, you could put it in a pipe and smoke it, you could put it in this water pipe, which is also called a bong, and smoke it. But when you do that, I don't disparage any method of administration. There are pros and there are cons to each. So the pro to smoking is that it interacts in your body very quickly. Within the first 15 minutes, you will see a peak. And then after about an hour, you'll see a drop off. So that's the pro. If you have a muscle spasm and you have an intense pain with it, that can, treat it very quickly. The bad part about that is that it goes away as quickly as it goes on. It doesn't stick around long. And also you're exposed to products of combustion, which can be cancer causing. And so therefore, if you smoke something and you're trying to do something for health, that may not be a way that you want to expose it. It also is an irritant to the lung tissue, as is the heat. Because of the heat, can lead to inflammation and bronchitis. There's a sentinel study by Dr. Taskin out of California that has shown that out of Washington State, that has shown that there is no correlation between smoking cannabis and lung cancer, even if you smoke cannabis and roll your joints with tobacco. So I'm imagining that maybe the anti-inflammatory effects of these potent chemicals prevent the cancer, but again, it doesn't prevent the coughing and bronchitis that you experience. Vaporizing, again, pros and cons. You don't get the acid forms for this in this method. The vaporizing sounds just like what I'm saying. You actually put it to a heat where it doesn't combust, but just causes steam. And that steam has those chemicals that you will get when you smoke, but you don't have those products of combustion. If you do it using a balloon, or if you vaporize a chemical, it's probably a little bit better. But my feeling is if you want it to be the purest without a bunch of chemicals, because to get it from the bud, which is this thing I'm showing here, to the pen, or to what this part is what's called dabbing, to get to that is a lot of chemical extraction, synthesis, processing. It's furthest from nature, and you're exposed to other kinds of concentrated oils. I'm worried that we're going to create over time, this is the great, people experiment with this stuff, a candle in our lungs, because the waxes don't go away, and you vaporize something at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Our 98.6 is relatively cold, and it solidifies in our lungs, and that makes me a little worried. But again, I don't want to vilify one versus another. Onset of this thing is about 15 minutes. It goes away quickly. So there are people who are developing aerosols so that it gets away from heating it. And because you heat it, you don't get any of the raw forms. In these non-heated methods, you can inhale these and get all the different types of molecules as formulated without worrying about the products of combustion or the bronchitis from the heat. These are still in its infancy, and we're looking into this. I'm actually running some clinical trials on this as well, trying to push this forward, because I think this could be an important method of administration. There's sublingual, under the tongue or buccal between the cheek and the gum. There are sprays, oil sprays, and there are tablets. The beauty of this is that your body can get it as formulated. So if you have the acid forms as well as the heated forms, you can be exposed to all of it. It goes under the tongue. The challenge is that a lot of it's swallowed, and we'll get into what swallowing does in a sec. So you probably don't get as much molecules as you would hope compared to when you smoke or when you inhale through vapor. The onset of action is not as fast, 20, 30, 45 minutes, but it tends to last longer in our system, maybe about somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. So if you have this intense muscle contraction. You take it, it goes away in a half hour, 45 minutes, and hopefully it sticks with you for about 2 to 4 hours. All right, eating. Everybody likes the eating stuff. We've got the familiar pharmaceutical look at capsules. We've got everything from teas to cookies to gummies to candies to even swallowing it in syringes. The challenge is that this is a very inefficient method for a couple of reasons. One, it goes from your mouth into your stomach. It gets hit with the stomach acids. Then it goes into your intestine. It goes to your liver. It gets broken down. So the molecules that you see that you're hoping to get, you only get about 8%, 6 to 8%. And then the most of it is the metabolite. And the metabolite of THC is hugely intoxicating, hugely. So people who are used to consuming cannabis by smoking or vaping or either under the tongue, when they eat a cookie or a gummy, sometimes they overconsume thinking that they're, real macho. And for the next 6 to 8 hours, they are laid out because the metabolite of these chemicals are way more intoxicating than the chemical itself. The beauty is that if you find your dose and you have a hard time sleeping because of pain or just insomnia, this stuff lasts from 6 to 8 hours. The challenge is that it takes very little to have an effect. And I don't know anybody who can eat a quarter of a cookie. So people tend to overdose because they're like, oh, this is good. It's a cookie, a quarter piece. And they're like, it's 15 minutes. I don't feel anything. It's a half hour. It's an hour. Well, sometimes this stuff doesn't kick in for an hour and a half to 2 hours. We tend to be impatient, and bigger, badder, better is our philosophy. And we tend to overconsume by eating an entire cookie, which may only be this big, or an entire piece of chocolate, which doesn't seem like a big deal. But again, it's more intoxicating. And then you have to ride it out for 6 to 8 hours. Fun fact, if you do have this problem and you're having a bad experience, taking pure CBD can help you sort of get off that uncomfortable feeling from THC if you overconsume. This is a lot bigger than really what it looks like in real life. But people make suppositories because, one, cannabis is not the most delicious tasting thing for most people because of those terpenes. And where we would put the rectal or vaginal has no taste buds, thankfully. There really has not been any studies proving to me the absorption of this actually goes throughout our whole body. But if you have a vaginal problem or a rectal problem, like a local Crohn's issue or an inflammation in that area, or dryness, this could be an incredibly wonderful way of using cannabis. Some people have said to me, Doc, I have used, 4 or 5 suppositories. I never felt a thing. And that sort of leads me to believe that it doesn't get absorbed systemically and that it actually acts as like a local or a topical administration. I think we're still, again, in our early days of formulation, and we'll find out. Topicals to me is the gateway drug. It's a gateway to understanding that cannabis is real. There's a difference between topical versus transdermal. Transdermal is using the skin as a portal for whole body or systemic utilization. Topical is literally to use it in a single area. And so I want to talk to you real quick. Oh, and there are receptors in our skin that prove that this could work. So if anybody's ever cut themselves, it hurts, right? So that's CB1 receptor. It's a nerve cell. If you get an infection or a cure on the skin, that's CB2, where the immune cells are. So the skin is a great portal, and we'll get into a case study. So I used to treat patients with all kinds of different crazy things, prostate cancer. So we had one gentleman who was 72. He had a recurrence of his cancer. I always ask my patients, what are their biomarkers? For him, it was his PSA level. So his PSA went to 7.8. They started him on Lupron. After a month, stayed the same. He called me hysterical saying, what's going on? It's not being cured with this Lupron injection. I change everybody's diets to a whole food, all plant, no added oil, no processed food diet, because if you're eating crap and your body's homeostasis is trying to fight off the garbage you're feeding it, it's not going to be able to help you heal, which is why you probably have a medical condition to begin with, or an inflammatory problem or whatever. So he changed his diet, and he went from a changed diet and Lupron and a small amount of cannabis oil under the tongue, both raw and heated. And his PSA in 1 month went almost in half. In month number 3, so third month of Lupron, second month of cannabis oil, second month of diet, it went to almost undetectable. Month 4, third month of cannabis oil and diet change, PSA went to undetectable. And this was 2016. He's still alive today with the PSAs that are undetectable. Maybe it's diet, maybe it's Lupron, maybe it's cannabis oil, maybe it's all of it. 81-year-old, he was otherwise healthy. He was diagnosed with back pain, finally found out that it was prostate cancer with metastasis to his lower back. They gave him seed implant, radiation, Lupron, nothing worked. His marker was an escalating testosterone level. The surgeon wanted to remove his testosterone manufacturing organ, which was his testes. He was not excited about that. He committed to changing his diet. We started him on low dose oil, and again, went from a testosterone level of off the charts. After the second week, not a month, a week of diet change, as well as cannabis oil, it dropped to 50%. 2 weeks later, it dropped to less than what they thought would be after an orchiectomy, removing of his testes. Week 6, it stayed. He was good this way for 2 years, and sadly, for whatever reason, he had a recurrence and he passed away. But it gave him 2 years. He remained intact without having surgery, and he enjoyed a wonderful life for 2 more years. And there are studies that show cancer and prostate cancer, brain cancer. So we had a 69-year-old man who woke up in the emergency room after a seizure, never had a seizure before in his life. The MRI revealed a brain tumor. He was lethargic. He was unable to perform his activities of daily living. I mean, he went from fully functional to this, and the only medication he took was an anti-seizure med. This is what his brain tumor looked like. It was called a glioblastoma. His wife reached out to me. We changed his diet. We started him on low dose sublingual cannabis oil. 2 weeks later, somebody ordered an MRI. I don't know who. In the US, you just don't give these things out in like oil. So it was surprising. And the radiologist wrote central cystic degeneration consistent with radiation treatment. Keep it up. But this was 2 weeks before he was even having his appointment with his radiation oncologist. So the only medicine he was on was the cannabis oil, the diet change, and the anti-seizure medicine. This is the comparison. Bad, good. Again, it was only 2 weeks. 9 months later, he had this. Sadly, he was going to the bathroom. He had a rug that was not secured on his floor. He tripped, he fell down the steps, and he died. Hit his head, bled into his head, and died. And the autopsy showed even smaller tumor. There are studies that show anti-tumor effects with glioblastomas in people and in rats and in petri dishes. All right, this patient always brings a tear to my husband's eye. This was an 8-year-old with acute lymphocytic leukemia, So leukemia is a white cell issue. As you remember, white cells are immune cells. They have CB2 receptors. I thought for sure cannabinoids would work beautifully on this 8-year-old for that reason. She failed chemotherapy, she failed radiation, she failed bone marrow transplant. She was on hospice, and the goal for her was to give her a better quality of life before she died. So she had a headache, she had no appetite, no energy. We met her, she was laying on a couch. And she was on methadone and morphine, literally, this poor 8-year-old child. We changed her diet, which was the hardest thing to do because her parents were giving her ice cream and McDonald's and garbage, thinking they'd love her with food. We begged them to stop it. The grandmother thankfully intervened. Whole food, all plant, no added oil, no processed food diet, gave her cannabis oil under the tongue 4 times a day. This white stuff on her brain was the metastasis of her cancer. Again, we wanted to get off her opiates. First month, we succeeded in getting off all opiates. And what happened was she started to become more active. She started to eat. She got off the couch. She started to exhibit appropriate 8-year-old behavior. And anyone who has children, who ever had children, who know of kids, that means talking back, refusing a bath, not following the request of the mom and the dad. And the mom's like, this is not the behavior of a sick, dying child, demanded another MRI, even though she was in hospice. And this was her MRI. And this was a little bit of cancer left over here in the back of her head, but that was it. So we transitioned this child from hospice to 2nd grade, to 3rd grade, to 4th grade, to 5th grade. Sadly, she was lost to follow-up. Her mother found religion. I'm not judging. I never had a sick child like this, whatever helped her get through, but she was lost to follow-up. And her grandmother called me and told me that, she passed after 6th grade, but still look at the power of this treatment. All she was on was cannabinoids and diet. And again, there are studies showing why this would work. Reduction of opiates. A kid, 35 years old, he's a kid to me, had a sinus surgery gone poorly, was on escalating doses of opiates. We changed his diet. We started him on low-dose cannabis. He had these intense spasms. He had a vape pen as well for the intense spasms, and got him off all of his opiates. Again, that shows it. And then remember we talked about topicals as the gateway drug. This is interesting. This gentleman had actinic keratosis, which is like a precancer. They scraped it off. It came back. They treated it with 5-FU, which was a topical chemotherapy, and a name that makes me chuckle because I'm a juvenile, even though I'm an old lady. We put him on this topical cannabis cream, and 6 weeks later, his dermatologist couldn't find the cancer. This woman was a horseback rider who did barrel riding. You weave in and out of barrels. This was her knee when her knee and horse contacted the barrel. She was competing the next day, was flipping out because this was all swollen and painful. 1 day later, this was Moose, the horse that she had the barrel encounter with. Moose had a swollen leg. This is 1 day later. We talked a lot about a lot of stuff. So cannabis, how it interacts with the cannabinoid system or endocannabinoid system. We talked about different methods of administration. I shared with you different stories for cases to sort of compel you that cannabis is not just for recreational use, although I don't disparage that either. Alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen, and yet we toast our children when they turn of legal age of drinking, and it breaks my heart because we kill brain cells. If you overconsume cannabis, fall and hit your head, it's a neuroprotectant. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity for having this conversation with really smart people who are open to all kinds of things. And so thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'm open. If we don't have enough time, this is my email. Feel free to use it.
Should there be a M at the end.com?
No, it's pgpharma.co.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Figure. But if anybody has any questions now, I can entertain them now.
So would stop the screen share then?
Yeah,
There.
we'll stop the screen share.
Okay. Yeah. Let me be the first to jump in if let's see how many questions we have. Just a minute. Just a small question. Sometimes I find that smoking the product, I know you don't like the word weed, can be harsh and sometimes it's mild.
Right.
So is that a difference in the quality of it, in the age of it, in just luck, or how does that work?
So I think it's a combination of a bunch of things. I think the drier it is, the drier the cannabis is, the harsher it is. The older it is, which equals drier, the harsher. And sometimes if it's treated with chemicals, you could be experience that harshness. There are little filters that people use when they make regular cigarettes. And I recommend people doing that to try to reduce the, if you're going to smoke a joint, to reduce the harshness of it.
So it was, there's such a thing here, maybe everywhere, of medical marijuana. Do I assume that's a better quality, fresher?
Yes. And the reason is that the beauty of these state and country run products is that they mandate testing. And the testing shows that, one, the potency is what you're getting. You know, the CBD and THC is actually in there. That they test for pesticides and they test for heavy metals. You know, cannabis plant and the hemp plant that makes CBD is a very great bioaccumulator. It sucks out all kinds of garbage from the soil and can remediate soil. In fact, if there is a Chernobyl anywhere again, they should just plant hemp and it will remediate the soil beautifully. The problem is that the cannabis bud, like a fish, will bioaccumulate that, and you don't want to have heavy metals or neurotoxins or any of those chemicals in your system. So that's why the beauty of a medical program is that it is more expensive, but it mandates these important testing. Good question.
Let me see if there's other ones. Someone, if they overdose, what can they do? You had said.
So there are new chemicals, there are new molecules coming out in the market. There's a company called Undo, and I think it's sold on the market. It's a levotolic acid that helps you with that overconsumption, over intoxicating feeling, but it's hard to get. CBD it acts as like, how do I say this? You ever in a swimming pool on a float and this really large person jumps in and creates this huge wave and bumps you off your float? That's CBD, is that really fat guy. And you sitting on the float is the THC molecule. And so CBD doesn't act specifically on that receptor, but sort of creates a change in the shape of that receptor and bumps off the THC to help you come down. So if you take CBD, it will help you come off that. And that's where I would vaporize or smoke it, because if you can get it in its pure form. I know Israel's weird about CBD because I've been the mule many a time from the US to Israel, bringing in straight up CBD products, which I find hilarious. It'll help you tremendously.
Okay. Someone says here that cannabis was found in a prestigious Israeli ancient tomb.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's been around with humanity wherever humanity has been, and Israel is killing me. You guys are killing me. It's the home of, the most important science, and yet the patient population gets screwed by your government and doesn't allow free access, just like in the US. and doesn't even allow access to CBD products that are tested and made sure that things are fine. This should be wide open. I mean, Rafi Meshulam is the father of cannabis science. He's your guy. And it's killing me. You know, at least we have stupid politicians here. You have smart scientists that have been around forever, and they should know this.
Well, Meshulam's brother, also named Meshulam,
Yeah.
was Sheldon's boss, my husband's boss.
Really? And his nephews are my friends.
Oh, there you go.
And sadly, he died at a young age from a aortic aneurysm rupture.
Yeah.
See,
No
we're
more
practicing.
questions. We have 0 time left. Debra,
Any
you're
more?
wonderful. You're terrific.
I am so grateful to be a part of this group. I'm so grateful to see so many people open to everything, and a shout out to every other lecturer who has huge important information. I mean, I love this past lecturer who gave the idea, like, it's raining. I'm going to have to use this. It's raining. It's how your perception is, you know, you deal with it in different ways. You put on your raincoat and your boots and your umbrella, and it's still raining, but you could deal with it better. Love that. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for being such an open-minded group of folks. And Ginat, we're going to see you in October. I'll be in Israel.
Okay, maybe we'll put something together.
Okay.
Well, that sounds great.
Thank you.
Okay, then. Thank you. Bye-bye.